Hello friends, welcome to Dr. Ossai Physiology Academy, D.O.P.A for short. This is the place where we make the learning of physiology easy, exciting, and effective. Thank you for joining me. So today we're going to be dealing with a brand new topic, control of ECF osmolarity. That's extracellular fluid osmolarity. Before we continue, always remember that learning about how the body functions, which is what physiology is all about, can teach you vital health lessons, life lessons, and even management lessons. All right, so let's get right into it. So why are we talking about control of ECF osmolarity? First of all, osmolarity is just talking about the concentration of the body fluids, okay? The amount is a measure of the amount of solutes in 1 liter of solution. So to just take it like that is a measure of how concentrated the ECF is. And we know that the major solute, or rather the major ion in the ECF is what? Sodium. Sodium ion. So whenever we're talking about ECF osmolarity, a lot of what we'll be talking about is water and sodium, these two, because sodium is the most abundant ion or electrolyte in the ECF, okay? So why are we not talking about ICF, that's intracellular fluid? They are both in communication with each other. Anyone that affects, whatever affects the ICF affects the ECF, whatever affects the ECF affects the ICF, okay? So they're in good communication. We've learned that in the previous lectures. All right, so one of the things that we talked about beginning renal physiology is how related water is to the function of the kidney in excreting wastes. Okay, so the kidneys excrete waste using water. So there's a lot of relationship between what the kidney does and water regulation. So part of the functions of the kidney is to regulate not just the waste in the body, not just the amount of electrolytes in the body, but also the amount of water. Because osmolarity has to do with the balance between these two. If this one is too high, it becomes hyperosmolar. That means it's now too concentrated. If this one is too much as against this, it becomes hypoosmolar. Hypoosmolar. You can remove this here, hyposmolar, okay? So that is it. So now we ask ourselves why. Because anything you are doing, anything you are trying to study, if you don't ask yourself why, you will be shallow. You will not get the depth of understanding that you need, and you easily forget. So like we did in the acid-base balance, we started by saying, why does the body even need to regulate the pH? And we now linked it to the fact that enzymes are very delicate and they need to function at a very narrow range of pH, about 7.37 to 7.42, and the midpoint 7.4. Hovers, because if it goes too much to the right or too much to the left, they become inactive, sometimes even denatured, because enzymes are made up of protein. And we said also that those enzymes in the first place are involved in all the chemical reactions in the body, the biochemical reactions. And biochemical reactions are the basis of all physiological processes. So that's how we understood that. So the same thing now we ask ourselves, why does the body need to? Because the osmolarity of the body fluid is about 300 milliosmoles per liter, solute per liter. Okay? So the body wants to maintain it around this value. So you ask yourself, why? If it goes too high, what will happen? Will anything spoil? If it goes too low, what will happen? Yes, something will spoil. Now, look at a cell. Surrounding the cell is interstitial fluid, okay? All cells are bathed in fluid. So now, if this interstitial fluid, because here is 300, interstitial fluid is 300. So let's say something happens, interstitial fluid moves to 380. What do you think will happen? Here is now more concentrated and here is hyperosmolar related to this place. So what happens is that osmosis begins to take effect. And osmosis has to do with the movement of water. So wherever is more dilute, which means there is higher concentration of water in that place, water will move to where it is less. So just understand it like this. It's a little bit confusing. Diffusion, we talk about the fact that it moves from higher concentration to lower. But here, the focus is on water molecules. In diffusion, the focus is on solute molecules. Okay, so water molecules move from where there is lower concentration of solute to higher concentration, or there is higher concentration of water to where there is lower concentration of water. So anywhere that is more concentrated has less concentration of water. So water will move out of this cell into this place so that there will be balance. So it means that this place will lose a lot of the water inside the cell. What happens? There is shrinkage. The cell now shrinks, and that is bad. When the cell shrinks, it affects the chemical reactions. There is little water. Chemical reactions occur in a solution in water. Also, the cell membrane, when it shrinks, it affects the integrity of the cell membrane. And the cell membrane is very key to the function of every cell because that's where so many things happen. Receptors are located in the cell membrane. So many molecules, carrier proteins, and all of that. What channels, different channels, and exchange. A lot of things happen around the cell. So if there is a problem due to that shrinkage, the cell will not function properly. You are in trouble. So that's why we need to maintain balance. It needs to be the same, what is inside here and what is outside. Okay? So, but in maintaining that balance, it should not affect the cell. The opposite happens. If here is low, instead of 300, it's now 220. What do you think will happen? That means water will move from here to here. That means it will make this one swell. The same problem. There's also a problem. It shouldn't be so. All right? So that is why there needs to be that control. And the body already has mechanisms, not just one mechanism, several mechanisms to ensure that this osmolarity is maintained. The ECF osmolarity, the focus is on the ECF, okay? ECF, because that's, the plasma is what moves, blood moves around. So that's why the focus is on the ECF. So make sure that the ECF is maintained at that 300. Once it's maintained at that 300, everything balances up. Okay? So now, what exactly happens when there is a change in osmolarity? Let's say, for example, the osmolarity increases. There are two things that can happen. When this ECF osmolarity increases, let's say 380 and so on, there are only two things that can happen. Either there is addition of solute. Let's say sodium is the most abundant. There is excess of sodium that is added to the ECF. So let's write it down. Increased osmolarity. One, it could be as a result of addition of excess sodium. What do you think the second one would be? Think about it for a moment. Second one would be that there is loss of water. So if there is loss of water, it will become more concentrated. So two things make the ECF osmolarity to increase. Addition of excess sodium and loss of water. So if you lose more water, it happens maybe when you are sweating. When you are sweating, you are losing more water than sodium ions, okay? When you sweat so much, you become dehydrated. At that moment, your ECF osmolarity increases. So these are the two major things that happen when there's increases in osmolarity. Either there is addition of excess sodium ion, which will increase it, or there is now loss of water. All right? So in this case, the volume of water in the body is the same. Normal volume. We say normal ECF volume, normal plasma volume, however. But here, it is reduced ECF volume. So the same problem, but different things are happening with the ECF volume. So you now ask yourself, what is the correction? We are setting a basis for how these things, the body uses different mechanisms in correcting this thing. So what do you think will be the correction? So number one, since it's addition of excess sodium, that means there is loss of sodium in excess of water. That is, more sodium ion is lost. Loss of sodium ion in excess of water. Then another one, since it is loss of water that can lead to, that means conservation of water can solve the problem. So we have conservation of water. So, but there is something that is also a problem, especially with this correction. How do you think that loss of sodium in excess of water can happen by itself? Because whenever sodium is being lost through the kidney, water usually follows it. That's the problem. Sodium and water always trying to move together. Whenever there's conservation of sodium, water is conserved with it. Remember, there are two different things. Conservation of water alone is different from conservation of sodium. Loss of sodium is different from loss of water. It's easy to conserve water alone, and it's easy to lose water alone. But it is not easy to conserve sodium alone, and it's not easy to lose sodium alone. That is where there is a challenge. And part of the correction is this. Now, let's say there's conservation of water, increased osmolarity, conservation of water. So when water is conserved, what do you think will happen? Remember that there's normal volume, but now you're not conserving water to add more water to dilute it. That means you will now increase the ECF volume, which in itself is a problem because the body also wants to maintain normal ECF volume. You know, the ECF volume we talked about that the plasma is 3 liters. When you are increasing the plasma volume, it leads to increased blood pressure. Remember, we said that before. When the blood volume increases, plasma volume increases, there's increased blood pressure. So that will pose a problem. Okay? So the body also has a way of solving that problem. So this is the basis of these things. So that's why they have different mechanisms. But we'll now see how the body eventually manages to solve this problem. Because in trying to solve one, another problem arose. They're trying to conserve water because of this. ECF volume is increased. You're trying to lose only sodium, but water is following it. So you now have decreased volume. So that's the problem. But now let's look at the different mechanisms and we'll see how all of them relate to each other and results in a perfect balance after this break. Right, welcome back. So now we want to talk about the different mechanisms and we'll see how they play different complementary roles in handling the ECF and osmolarity issue. Okay? So one of the mechanisms is ADH, Antidiuretic Hormone mechanism. This is quite easy. When there is increased osmolarity, what happens is that there are cells in the hypothalamus. Okay, they are osmoreceptors. And what they do is that those cells, they are sensitive to osmolarity in the sense that when there is increased ECF osmolarity, it leads to shrinkage of the cells. So when there is a little shrinkage of those cells, they release impulses, electrical impulses that activate the release of ADH in the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so ADH leads to increased osmolarity, leads to, first of all, shrinkage of osmoreceptors in hypothalamus. So that shrinkage activates it. It releases electrical impulses that is sent to the posterior pituitary gland. That's where ADH is stored. There are two hormones in the posterior, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So it now releases this ADH in proportion to the amount of impulse. The higher the osmolarity, the more the shrinkage, the more the impulse, and the more the release. So like we have already said in previous lectures, that this ADH will do what? It will go to the distal tubule and the collecting ducts to do what? To lead to the insertion of aquaporins. So aquaporins are inserted, which means that water can now be transported through those water channels back into the blood. It leads to reabsorption of water. So what is happening is this ADH mechanism is conservation of water. That's what it's doing. ADH mechanism leads to conservation of water in order to now dilute the ECF to bring it back to normal. Okay? But when this, like I said before, if the volume is normal, but there's excess sodium, conservation of water will increase the ECF volume. But that's a problem. So what do you think can happen? Now, there is another mechanism. It's called the Atrial Natriuretic Peptide mechanism. Okay? So let's write it somewhere. It's what we call atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay? So atria, from the name, that means the atrium, the upper chamber of the heart. Natriuretic, sodium peptide. So it's trying to tell us that this peptide, it functions as a hormone. It helps in the loss of sodium. But you now ask yourself, what is the trigger for the release of this atrial natriuretic peptide? Is expanded volume expansion. When ECF volume becomes increased, pressure is increased, and we don't want increased pressure. So that increased pressure stretches the walls of the atrium. You understand? When there's increased volume, it stretches the walls of the atrium and it detects it. That's increased stretching is detected by mechanoreceptors. So there are mechanoreceptors in the walls of the atrium. So when they detect that increased stretching, they release ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. So this atrial natriuretic peptide, it goes to the kidney to do what? To lead to increased loss of sodium and by default, loss of water. So this leads to increased loss of sodium and water. Remember, we said that water alone can be easily lost and water alone can be easily conserved, but sodium alone cannot be lost and sodium alone cannot be conserved. It must go with water. So that's what this does. So it's losing sodium so that it can lose water. So this one corrects increased volume. What triggers it is increased volume. So it reduces both sodium and water so that the volume comes back to normal. Okay? So when this one acts, ADH acts, and if peradventure the AGA mechanism leads to increased volume of the fluid, it will now lose equal amounts of both sodium and water to bring it down. Is it making sense? Remember that the trigger here is increased osmolarity. The volume is the same, it's normal, I mean, but there is now addition of excess sodium also. And then when there is now conservation of water, it leads to increase. That's when this is the problem. But sometimes this can be the problem. So conservation of water does not increase the volume because the volume is already low. All right. So this is how atrial natriuretic peptide solves that problem. Remember that where the challenge is in this addition of excess sodium ion. The problem is always when there is unilateral addition of sodium. Okay, so that increases the ECF volume when it tries to conserve water, and this mechanism can solve that problem because this mechanism is losing sodium and losing water equally. So it balances everything. So let's see another mechanism. Now, there's another mechanism called the RAS. What is RAS? Renin-Angiotensin-Aldosterone system. Okay? So how does this operate? So look at what happens. In this system, what triggers it is when there is reduced volume, blood volume. So it happens more in the case of this loss of water. Remember, we started increased osmolarity from the addition of excess sodium. Now, when there is loss of water, what happens is that there is now reduced blood pressure. And the body cannot cope with reduced blood pressure. When there's reduced blood pressure, it affects the organs. There's not enough delivery of blood to the organs and tissues of the body. Blood supply is reduced. So the fastest way the body tries to solve that problem is to constrict the blood vessels in order to increase the blood pressure. But there's a limit to which the body can go through that constriction of blood vessels alone. So it needs to raise up the blood volume. So that's where this mechanism comes into play. So the juxtaglomerular cells, remember we talked about juxtaglomerular apparatus. So the juxtaglomerular cells, which is part of the juxtaglomerular apparatus, they're the ones that detect that reduced blood flow. So immediately they detect reduced blood flow, they release renin. This is renin. So what does renin do? Renin is like an enzyme. Renin leads to the conversion of angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. That's the function of renin. Renin does this, converts this to this. But this is not effective. It doesn't do anything. Has no physiological role or function in the body. So this needs to be converted further into an active form. So there is an enzyme that now does that. It's called angiotensin converting enzyme. Short form ACE. So this angiotensin converting enzyme converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. From the name angiotensin 2, you see that it constricts the blood vessel. So it immediately solves the problem of blood pressure, because reduced blood flow means there's low blood pressure. So it constricts the vessels immediately, quickly, so that the blood pressure increases. But then it needs to increase the blood volume, because the ECF volume or blood volume has been reduced. Okay? So what it now does further is that this angiotensin 2 has another role to play, which it enables the release of aldosterone. Aldosterone is located at the cortex of the adrenal gland. Okay? So you have adrenal gland. And interestingly, the adrenal gland is very close to the kidney. You see the name, renal, kidney, adrenal. It's also known as suprarenal. They just sit on top of the kidney. Suprarenal gland, or more commonly, adrenal gland. Okay? So the cortex of the adrenal glands, they secrete this hormone known as aldosterone, and it is one of the things that can stimulate aldosterone secretion is angiotensin 2. So now, what does aldosterone do? Aldosterone, as we've mentioned in previous lectures, aldosterone at the distal tubule also and collecting ducts, it leads to the retention of sodium, which means sodium is reabsorbed, more reabsorption of sodium. And as more sodium is reabsorbed, more water follows, which now increases the volume. Okay? So that increases the volume. So, but you see that all these mechanisms, they are not entirely perfect. Especially because sodium cannot go by itself. Whenever sodium is trying to be conserved, water follows it. Because sometimes all you need is just only sodium. Because sodium is reduced, the ECF volume is okay. You just need more sodium alone. But the body now, in trying to conserve sodium, to take more sodium, at the same time takes water with it. So all this put together does not entirely solve the problem. Remember, we mentioned 3: ADH mechanism, which does only water. Then this one, both sodium and water. This one also, both sodium and water. So you see that there's still not perfect balance. So there is the 4th mechanism. We've mentioned 3: ADH, Atrial Natriuretic Peptide, and Renin-Angiotensin. But there is another mechanism. So the 4th final mechanism that the body has is the thirst and salt appetite mechanism. Okay? So if there is still not a fine balance with all these mechanisms, simply because of the fact that whenever the kidneys are excreting wastes, it must go with water. So whether you like it or not, water must be lost from your body. Whether you're taking water or not, the kidneys must use at least 500 mils to flush out waste. This is the minimum in a day. This 500 in a day. Talking about a day, okay? So the kidney must use at least 500 mils of water to flush out wastes. Whether you don't take in water for 3 days, every 24 hours, it must lose. So you are losing water. So the perfect ultimate solution must always be something external coming in. So that's where this test comes in. When you are thirsty, you are hungry, you are looking for water. It makes you uncomfortable, except you take water alone. If you go and take Coke, the thirst will not be satisfied. What it needs is pure water. Okay? So just as a digression, this is called the obligatory water loss. Okay? That means it's a must, whether you like it or not. You must lose 500 mils of water in 24 hours to flush out wastes. No matter how dehydrated you are, you must lose this. That's why it's called obligatory. Okay, that's that. So this is where the thirst mechanism comes into play. Addition of water, pure water alone. But we said that, yes, the internal mechanisms, you can conserve water alone. But the problem has always been you cannot lose sodium alone. You cannot conserve sodium alone. But this is where this salt appetite mechanism comes into play. Not that nobody eats salt, okay? But it's just telling you that you can take food that is, the osmolarity is higher. There's a lot of salt, more salt in that food than water. Okay? Because when sodium is being lost or is being conserved, proportionate water follows it. But in this case, there's a disproportionate addition. Okay? Disproportionate addition of salt. There's more we are taking something that has increased osmolarity. We call it hyper. We're taking in hyperosmolar content. It can be fluids, it can be, but mostly foods. So there's this craving, more craving for saltier foods. So that's where you now take in a food that has more salt than water, because all this internal mechanism cannot lose more sodium than water. It cannot conserve more sodium than water. So this is where it balances everything. This test mechanism balances the fact that water is always lost in the excretion of urine, no matter what happens. So you must take water. Then also salt. Because if you are taking water, your body fluids become dilute. The salt mechanism goes into play. You take more salt. So this is how the body balances everything. ECF osmolarity. So just think about it. It's not so difficult to understand. So just know the different mechanisms, okay? So what can we learn from this? It's simple, that you need to have different ways to solve a particular problem. Those different ways, they have slightly different mechanisms in order to bring about a balance. You want to solve a problem of heat in your house. There are different ways you can solve it. You can solve the problem through maybe putting on the fan. You can solve the problem by putting on the air conditioner. You can also solve the problem by opening the windows and so on. So you see the different. So that's how, this is just a very simplistic example I'm giving, but in so many areas of your life, always remember that there are more than one ways to solve a problem. Sometimes you need to combine those ways. Sometimes you need to use just one of them. So it applies. So whenever you see a problem, don't always think that there's only one solution. There is not only one solution. Every correctional homeostatic mechanism, control mechanism in the body, it's a combination, it's an integration of several other processes. The body does not use only one solution to solve a particular problem. So you too realize that the same thing applies. When you feel you are stuck, oh, this solution I'm trying to bring doesn't perfectly solve it, there's another solution, another mechanism. Just find it. So just for further reading, you can check out the description box. You see so many links there. I've written a book on renal physiology. These things are there for you to get a better grasp and other areas of physiology if you want. So just go there, click the link to direct you to Okada Books. Just for a token, download the book there, soft copy, and read. All right. So you can also visit our website. It's also there in the description box, www.deocrestconsult.com.ng. You see so many other things and resources and programs that we have set up for you so that to maximize and optimize your learning process of physiology. All right. So see you in the next video.